Hello, good afternoon. This is the last session, and it is a session on the IANA transition process. We have a big panel, as you will see. So first of all, I would like to ask our panelists to be as concise and succinct as possible, and try also to make a very complex issue a little bit simpler. As you all know, on the 14th of March of last year, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration announced its intention to transition key domain name functions to the global multi-stakeholder community. And since then, the global multi-stakeholder internet community has been working tirelessly to craft the proposals that will be submitted finally to the NTIA. At the back, we have a set of slides. This is essentially how the IANA stewardship transition has currently been working. The NTIA announcement took place, as I said, on March of last year. The NTIA asked ICANN to convene the process, and ICANN did so in its Singapore meeting. And as part of this process, the IANA coordination group was created, which asked the three operational communities, the Internet Engineering Task Force, the Regional Internet Registries, and the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers to activate their own multi-stakeholder processes and draft the proposals that will later be submitted to the IANA coordination group, which responsibility is to compile all three proposals into one narrative and submit them eventually to the NTIA for final approval. This is what the IANA Stewardship Coordination Group looks like. It is a multi-stakeholder group. It consists of people from stakeholders, from different representing different interests. We have civil society, governments, businesses, the technical community, etc. The IANA stewardship transition, as you all know, has generated a lot of interest for many reasons, not only because this is a historical moment, it is the last piece of the technical infrastructure of the internet that actually we were seeing a sole government overseeing, but also because it relates to issues of accountability as well as how this process fits into some wider internet governance issues that are happening in 2015, and in particular the WSIS plus 10 review. So without further ado, I will ask, first of all, the three operational communities to give us an update of where things stand in their own communities. And first of all, we'll go to Elliot Lear, who will be speaking not on behalf of the ITF, but he will be presenting where the Internet Engineering Task Force currently, the proposal currently stands. Elliot.
Thank you very much, Constantine. So, yes, my name is Elliot Lear. I work at Cisco Systems, and I do not speak on behalf of anybody at the ITF or the IAB. So the ICG was formed, and they put out their solicitation. And as they did, we do what we always do at the IETF, which was we had a birds of a feather session to discuss it. And then we did what we would do when we want to do something at the IETF, which is we form a working group. And then the working group found a document. I was the first co-author of it, and I'm now the co-editor of it. And the working group worked on the document a lot. We had 9 revisions in about 3.5 months. Actually, 10 revisions, excuse me. So there's quite a lot of work. We met in Honolulu, Hawaii, where the IETF held its in-person meeting in November. And then shortly thereafter, the Internet Engineering Steering Group approved the document and sent it on to the ICG in January, being the first of the 3 groups, operational groups, to send something along. The key things I want to just point out are that the IETF is very satisfied with the current state of affairs and how things work between the IETF and ICANN when it comes to the IANA functions. We are essentially their customer, and they serve us really well. We have SLAs that say they serve us really well. And so the proposal says all of this and says that we would like pretty much more of the same, that we'd like the way things are to continue. There are small changes that we're suggesting in an add-on agreement to be taken on. But really, that is the key message, is that really no major structural or changes are needed in terms of the way that ICANN supports the IETF with regard to the IANA functions. And I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you very much. That
Keeping it short.
You only took 2 minutes, literally 2 minutes. Before going on to Nurani, I would like to, after we hear from the 3 operational communities, their updates, please start thinking of questions that you would like to ask our panelists relating to their processes as well as to the accountability and the bigger IG issues. Nurani, can you give us an update, please, on where the numbers community proposal stands currently?
Thank you. I certainly can. My name is Nurani Nimpuno. I work for NetNode, and I'm the vice chair of the CRISP team, which is the team that was tasked to put together the proposal for the numbers community. And like Elliot, I don't speak on behalf of the CRISP team, but I will try to give an overview of what the process has been so far and the main elements of the proposal in a very concise way. Very much, well, for those who don't know, when we talk about the numbers community, we talk about the community that decides on the policies for IPv4, IPv6 addresses and AS numbers. And these are distributed through the regional internet registries. There are 5 of them in the world. And each RIR has a community under them, so to speak, responsible for the policy development. So the RIRs themselves don't do policy development, but the communities that are behind the RIRs do that. So the CRISP team was put together with representatives from all these 5 regions, and we were tasked to put together the proposal. But long before the CRISP team was actually put together, the RIRs, as soon as the NTIA had come out with the announcements, the RIRs started their discussions in their regional communities. So what differs us perhaps from for example, the IETF is that we have these 5 different regional communities. So the discussion started like we always do with policy development, started on a local level. And each RIR had consultation processes. The year following the NTIA announcement, the RIRs had discussions at their meetings. What became, this is more of a personal reflection, but I think what became very clear maybe to others who are not that familiar with the RIR processes was that really it showed that the RIRs are mature and as structures, because we could use very much the existing processes that we had. We didn't need to pull together a community to discuss this particular issue. We had our meetings, we had mailing lists, we had processes and structures for this. And then the CRISP team went through a few consultations. The first task was, of course, to gather all the input from all the 5 regions. There were slight variations, of course, in the various regions. And the CRISP team came out with text to try to reflect that. And we worked in a very intense period over Christmas and New Year's to produce the final response in January this year. And it was very encouraging to see, despite the fact that it was in this very intense period, that we got great community participation in the process. So we handed in our proposal in the 15th of January. So where are we now? Well, first of all, maybe what are the main elements? So currently the IANA serves the RIRs and provides IPv4, IPv6 addresses and AS numbers. But there's not a contract as such between the RIRs and IANA or ICANN for this, as this is currently held by the NTIA. So the main part of the proposal is really to propose a new arrangement where the RIRs enter into a service level agreement with ICANN. Very much like the protocol community, the RIRs have been very happy with the IANA services provided. We saw no need to change this, and there was also great emphasis on continuity and stability in the proposal. There are other various minor elements, like a review committee, just to ensure added participation from the community when reviewing the SLAs, and a few things like that. So where are we now? Well, the proposal is out there. We are now in the phase where we will be trying to find a consolidation with the other communities, but there are also a few steps that the RAR communities need to go through, such as finalizing the SLA and getting comments on that. We have a draft out for that, and also defining this review committee. And that's pretty much where we are. There'll be other parts of the implementation where the RARs will be consulting the community. But apart from that, we are pretty much ready to go. So thank you.
So the ITF and the RARs have actually submitted their proposals to the ICG, and since then we have heard that there has been close communication. Olivier, what's happening with the names?
The names are late as usual. Well, actually, the complexity of what needed to be done was a magnitude further than the community of the numbers and the protocols, because in the case of the names, and the slide is not working. Great, well, that's normal. It's the names, always a problem there. In the case of the names, the IANA, well, the contractor, so the IANA operator was ICANN, but the policy-making body is also ICANN. So it was going to be a bit of a challenge for ICANN to sign a contract with itself. So something had to be done, and a number of changes had to be proposed and built up, and so it took a rather longer time than the other communities to come up with a proposal. Immediately after, well, back in October, basically, there was at ICANN, the 53rd meeting of ICANN, there were already some discussions that took place, and a first meeting took place in Frankfurt in November of a cross-community working group, which we will refer to as CWG, and I'll tell you why later. CWG Stewardship was created that had people from all the different parts of ICANN, but also some country code operators that were not part of the country code name supporting organization. They came up with a first proposal that went over for public comment in December 2014. The proposal was very different from what we now have on the table, because there was quite a lot of pushback towards many of the points that were put across in the proposal, and therefore something had to be done. We had to go back to the drawing board and restart looking at what we had proposed and seeing what we would need to change so as to actually go in line with the public comment process. I think I'm supposed to be in the previous slide. That's the one. Yeah. No, the one in the middle. Yeah, okay, that's more like it. Sorry, because I'm seeing people looking and going like, this guy's talking something totally different. No, that's the diagram. So over in January, we had some intensive work days to restart the process and look at our work. And then we divided into design teams, started with 7 models, that came down to 2 models, and then finally to 1 model in early May. And that's when we had a second proposal that was put out for public comment. The sort of 20-ish days of public comments and so on received, 28 days, sorry. We received a lot of comments. At the moment, we are still reviewing the comments, and we're building the final proposal that we will be able to then send over to the process, where it will then go over to the chartering organizations in ICANN that need to ratify it. Then it will go through the board over to the ICG, the IANA Coordination Group. And that's where we're going. If we go to the next slide.
Thank you. So, but As part of this process, there is also, the NTIA has also mentioned the elements of accountability.
And that's correct. So that's the next slide. That's this one. Associated with all of the work that we're doing in CWG IANA, there's also a cross-community working group on ICANN accountability, because we needed to actually make some changes with regards to that in ICANN. And so there's a group that works in parallel with the group on IANA stewardship that's still working at the moment. A public comment has just finished. There will be another public comment period with an actual proposal on the table in August. And then later on, there's going to be several public comments as well when implementation takes place, because it's good to put the plans, but then the plans have to reflect, what it gets implemented has to reflect what the plans are. So there's still quite a lot of opportunity for everyone to get involved, and we are looking at input, because ICANN accountability is key to the way this whole system is going to work at the end. So I think that's it for the time being. I've probably overstepped the time needed for this.
No, actually, you're good. Sounds
Okay,
pretty complex, right? But before we start discussing in more detail issues of accountability, one of the questions that I have to all of you actually is, so why does this process, why does this stewardship transition actually matter for the global internet? Why are we going through this extensive process? Why does it matter? Who wants to take this? Yanis?
So if you insist, let me step back and go to 2005, when for the first time international community addressed in the UN setting issue on internet governance. So at that time we were talking about critical management of critical internet resources, which were heavily dependent and overseen by one government. And gradually, over a period of 10 years, we have seen considerable development of the management going away from very tight oversight, and the oversight more and more was exercised by internet community, including governments. Over a period of 10 years, Government Advisory Committee of ICANN grew from about 40 governments at the time of 2005 up to 150, if I'm not mistaken, today. So we see that even from that perspective, involvement of governments in the work of ICANN has changed considerably. At the same time, the oversight attribution of IANA contract and oversight of changes or validation of changes in root zone file was the only remaining function that was directly implemented by NTIA. And obviously that this was one of the things 10 years ago international community expected, that there would not be, this would change. So we have come to this period of change. Of course, we cannot compare Internet of 2005 and then 2015 in its complexity, in its scale, in its usability, and so on. That's why the seemingly simple task has triggered so much attention and focus of Internet community. So we need to make it right. And I no doubt that wisdom will prevail, and we will find the best way of doing it. So, and therefore, going towards VISIS plus 10 review process and a high-level meeting in December, I think it would be a very good signal if Internet community would be able to present a credible plan that would take a lot of political tensions out of the conversation about VISIS plus 10 review.
Thank you. Bill, please, anything to add?
Good afternoon. I was just going to add one quick point to Jana says, it's a footnote, I guess. 10 years ago, as part of the WSIS process, we had a working group on internet governance that was constituted under the authority of the Secretary General to help try and break the deadlocks over internet governance. And it had a number of different functions. It was a multi-stakeholder group, and it had a number of different functions, one of which was to define internet governance, but another was to try to think about the, quote, oversight of the critical internet resources. And we had members in our group from governments who put forward a number of different proposals for oversight mechanisms to take over the IANA functions from the United States through a global internet council or some other kind of UN-based mechanism. One of the options that was put forward, one of the models that was put forward was from the civil society participants, and it said basically there's no need for a specific oversight mechanism. This could be done by the community, and if anything, we may simply need to enhance the role of ICANN's Government Advisory Committee a bit in order to give governments a greater sense that their concerns are being taken on board. This is in effect what we're doing now. So the approach that's being followed has been part of the dialogue over the past decade, really, among governments and other actors about the final disposition of the IANA functions. And it is, I think, one that has attracted, over time, progressively more and more support. There was a time early on where many governments thought, no, the only way this could be dealt with fairly is in an intergovernmental setting. And as we've talked through the process and gone through a collective learning cycle one after another, I think a lot of governments have now converged towards understanding that this kind of model that we're putting on the table of community-led, multi-stakeholder guidance and stewardship works and is effective and can perform the functions that are needed. So I see this as being part of a trajectory that has worked, ultimately. Many people are cynical about these things, but I think we're getting where we need to be after a long process of global dialogue involving all parties.
Sure, but also as the fact that we are here right now in 2015 and we're discussing this, a core element of this, as we've heard, and I would like us to discuss a little bit more, is accountability. We have heard that the NTIA stating that they would like to see some very specific accountability issues being addressed as part of this IANA function transition. So, moving on to you, Athina, why do you think accountability is such a core process of the internet governance discussions? What makes accountability such a core issue? And we have heard that the numbers community as well as the ITF have always had this structure in place. So can you walk us through a little bit as to why it is important? Sure,
thank you, Konstantin. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Athina Fragouli. I'm the legal counsel of RIPE NCC, which is one of the 5 RIRs. Back to your question. Let's take a step back and let's see first what accountability is, because it seems to be like the new buzzword, like for the last year at least. Accountability is a very difficult term to define because it means different things for different structures. I can use the example of the RIRs, sure. What is accountability for RIRs? It's compliance with what the numbers community wants. For this purpose, we have a bottom-up, inclusive, transparent, open policy development process. We are constantly in communication with the community. And also for RIRs, accountability is another thing, is the operational accountability. RIRs are membership-based organizations. They have executive boards that are elected and are responsive to the members. And we have our governance documented in a transparent manner for reference. And of course, this is an always evolving framework that always responds to what the numbers community wants. And that was just an example. Different institutions have different needs and different accountability models. And it's important to understand that there is not a one-size-fits-all model for accountability. Also, it's important to understand that accountability helps establishing trust. And trust is not a given. It's something that we have to achieve, and it's something that we always have to work on to maintain communities' trust. Also, why is trust important in this process? Having trust to the organizations that are critical for the internet governance enhances trust to the bottom-up internet governance model itself. So when a year ago the whole IANA transition discussion started, we saw that ICANN was subject to criticism. And ICANN is a very important organization in this internet governance model. And we had concerns that this would reflect to the whole internet governance structure. So the numbers community and the RIRs wanted to take action, and they wanted to help in this attempt and an effort to enhance ICANN accountability. We participated in the CCWG, in the cross-community working group for the enhancement of ICANN accountability. We supported this process. And this group now has a proposal, as it's already said. The group identified 2 areas that would need an improvement. One was the community empowerment. Another was the review and redress mechanisms within ICANN. And as it has been already said, they published a first draft proposal, and it was open for public consultations. And there are more opportunities for comments and consultations in the future. And I cannot stress enough how important that is, as we said, for the maintaining of the trust in this internet governance model. And with that, I give it back to you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, ICANN, as we've heard for everyone, is going through an extensive process right now concerning accountability. There are 2 working streams, one that relates to those issues that directly affect IANA, and the other one is the institutional accountability of ICANN. Jean-Jacques, what are the lessons emerging from these discussions that can be applied more broadly to other interinstitutions, or generally, what are the lessons that we can learn?
Thanks, Konstantinos. Actually, it's good to piggyback on both what Bill just said and what Afina just said. The fact that we've got, already 10 years ago, civil society was telling us, you know what, this community can handle it itself. Thank you. And what's interesting is that over the past 10 or so years, there has been a lot of learning about the multi-stakeholder model, or multi-stakeholder models. It's done slightly differently in different ways, but it's basically about working together, bringing different perspectives together, different stakeholders together. And where we find ourselves now, after 16 odd years of ICANN's existence, is that the model has matured. And in terms of the critical functions that it performs flawlessly. The domain namespace hasn't broken in 16 years. And that's thanks to the community, no one else. It's a community work, it's a collaborative work. That's not, I said, the critical function. It's not to say everything works perfectly. It's a pioneering, it's an experiment in a new type of governance which is needed because for perhaps the first time in history we have a truly global medium which just can, and that's truly transnational, that brings transnational communities together, which you cannot be handled in the traditional way. And what's been happening over the past 16 years is this model has slowly matured, so that by now there's both more understanding of simply this multi-stakeholder model existing, and then increasingly how it works, and the fact that by now it's starting to seriously prove itself. So it's a really important juncture. It's the, if you want, we've come to maturation, we've come to independence of that model, the community being ready to take the matters in its own hand. And I think then we move on to the transition process itself. And that has united all these different communities into one clear shared mission, which is to perform this transition and to bring with it extra layers of accountability and good governance. And that coming together, that shared mission, when I've looked at it as ICANN being the secretariat, a facilitator for this experience, and seen these very different groups of people, lawyers, engineers, economists, civil society folks, just coming together, working together, producing, frankly, high quality work. And that in itself is reinforcing the multi-stakeholder model. It's bringing it to yet another level. To me, that's really exciting in itself. And so, if we think about the future of governance, it's a really interesting model. It's a model that's starting to seriously prove itself, to consolidate, to strengthen, which actually is one of the conditions posed for the transition, that the multi-stakeholder model is enshrined or reinforced. And I think it's exciting. If we look at the next 10 or 20 years or so, not only should we think about how this multi-stakeholder model is apt for coordinating how the internet works, but maybe how it could help us in other spheres of international life. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Jacques. So before we proceed, are there any questions from the audience at this stage? Sébastien, please.
Thank you very much. Sébastien Bachelet, talking on my own behalf, but member of the CCWG, representing EuroDIG, the European Organization of at Large. If I take some of your speech, yes, the organization has matured, but the trust seems to be destroyed. We talk about a proposition from the CCWG. I am sorry, but we don't have a proposition. We have a report with propositions. And what is important today, it's we would like to have your inputs to say what is the best way to go. We are not in agreement, even within the working group, of what is the best solution. And I hope that the discussion that we will have in the next few weeks and months will allow to find a solution which is acceptable by everybody and not by just few. And it's not yet the case. And when I heard about adding extra layer, this organization, it's already very complex. And if we add layer to layer, at the end of the day, it will not be understandable by a simple user. Then we have to do the work to also decrease the complexity of this organization. In the same time, I am complaining or saying a lot of bad things. I would like to say one thing. It's better to have this organization and to have the internet governance than to have people outside of the room of certain negotiation in the other fields like water or the climate, and that people are together. Then even my criticism, it's not to say it's a bad things, but it's need to be discussed and we have some months to find the right solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nurani, would you like to react to this? Thanks. Chris.
Yes, I'd like to react, not because I'm heavily involved with the CCWG, but because I'm heavily involved in the numbers community. I've been an active participant, maybe not for 20 years, but for 15. And I think in all these discussions, we always end up discussing names and ICANN. And I'm fine with that. We don't need to be the center of attention. But if we want to look at another aspect of that question, why is this important? I think it actually, if you look at the RIR communities, you can see that this is a model. It's not something that we've come up with overnight. It's a model that has been developed and matured and been maturing over the last 20 or so years. And we tend to be a bit those of us who are active in that community tend to be a bit blind to what goes on in there. But I think it's also an opportunity to actually show governance models that work. The RAR structures and the bottom-up, inclusive, participatory processes, transparent, accountable processes that we have there, they work. So you can see it in that way too. There are models there that have proven to work, not just in this transition, but over the last 2 decades. And that's actually a really important message, that this multi-stakeholderism is a word that was invented quite recently, but these models have existed for a long time, and they work.
Thanks, Nurani. Elliot, very quickly, and then Olivier before we go on to the...
I am nothing if not quick. I would just add on to everything that Nurani said. I agree with it, and point out that from the IETF context, we also have that similar maturity, and things are working, as far as we're concerned. So at least that's what our proposal says. And I'd just add that if you want to test the maturity of something, one example would be that what happens when there's a difference of opinion or dispute. And to give you an idea, the proposal that we put forward was in fact appealed by someone, and the appeal was not sustained, but it was appealed, and it did test our processes, and they work.
Thank you. Olivier?
Yeah, thanks, Konstantinos. What's interesting is these models are actually all proven models by now. They're not just brand new models that we're making up. This multi-stakeholder process has been going on for a long time. And they're different in their own way, because the IETF doesn't work the same way ICANN works and doesn't work the same way as the RIRs work. But at the end, it all works. And the internet has been run like this, bottom-up, multi-stakeholder. A top-down model might have probably not been able to achieve the same thing. And this is something that we have to keep in mind. So now we're facing this big test and making sure we've got big decisions ahead of us and we get the right proposal out there. It takes a little bit more time. Well, I think it might well be that a top-down model would have taken years. And the work that's been done so far is truly remarkable. So I think that we're going to see the end of it with proposals on the table, and it'll be really fascinating to see what NTIA comes back with when they read it.
It's really fascinating. Henriette?
Maybe we should have more questions first.
I thought you wanted to react to this.
Well, just a quick reaction to this. I think that there's a tendency to generalize when we talk about internet governance. I think what we're talking about here are very specific processes that evolved to address very specific functions. But somehow then the discourse goes to it works, implying that this model is working for internet policy and governance at large. I don't see it working that well, not when there's content control and censorship in many countries, when the national level legislation actually and practice by governments and practice by businesses affects in a very direct way how users interact with and use the internet. So I think that there's a tendency for us to take those successes that we have in these quite confined domains of internet layer, yes, and then assume from that this model is actually working for internet users everywhere and for the internet everywhere. So just a word of caution there, and maybe we'll come back to that later. But just one connection, just one example of where I think these different worlds connect and where there's a real weakness is while ICANN has succeeded in increasing government participation, and the GAC is a much more present and I think quite influential forum within ICANN, and it's much bigger. To what extent are those GAC representatives going back to their countries and engaging in any kind of public participation process, be it multi-stakeholder or not, which actually then creates a link between what happens at a national level and more traditional models of accountability and public participation and this global multi-stakeholder model.
So let's park this and go to the questions. Chris.
Yeah, Chris Buckridge from Ripen CC. I'm assuming most of you aren't really looking at the Twitter wall behind you, but one of the tweets that's been retweeted a number of times is about how will this affect my cat blog, which I think was probably posted in light humour, but I think there's been a lot of talk this week about sort of speaking for the users and what does this mean to the users. I'm not sure that's necessarily a useful distinction. I think there are plenty of things that go on in the internet that the users themselves, the end users sitting at home doing Facebook or whatever, don't need to know about or won't sort of come into contact with. But I guess I wanted to ask, sort of from that idea, how well has this process, this multi-stakeholder process, communicated to the people that it needs to communicate to, do you feel? Has it reached everyone that needs to be involved? Has it conveyed to them why they should be involved? What's going on here? What's important about this? I guess I'd be curious really as to anyone's opinion on that.
Volunteers? Bill?
Well, I guess there's two levels to that, Chris. I'm here, I guess, not because I teach at the University of Zurich, but because I chair a civil society coalition within ICANN that has 420 members and has been very actively involved in these processes. And we have tried very hard within our community and within the larger internet governance aware civil society community to convey the importance of what's happening and to encourage participation. And we've been able to see that, in fact, our members who are actively engaged in the various working groups and so on have really been able to have quite a bit of impact on the discourse, on the discussions, in ways that I think are quite heartening and certainly something that you would not find in any intergovernmental context. So that's the good news. If people choose to get engaged and enter into Planet ICANN, they can, or the ICANN sphere, they can in fact have a good deal of influence. I mean, civil society has more ability to directly participate in making policy and in shaping outcomes in ICANN than in any other space I know that actually does things. I'm not talking about environments where we do multi-stakeholder dialogue. Dialogue is great, but I'm talking about actually shaping policy. ICANN actually provides that possibility. But, of course, could we claim that we reach out to all of global civil society effectively and that everybody is fully aware of the range of issues involved? No, of course not. We're volunteers. It's taxing enough just to participate in these processes, which are extremely labor intensive. I'm on Skype all day long with people who are exchanging 600 messages a day on the same channel, trying to figure out all this stuff. They are very intensively working on this stuff. There's not a lot of juice left over to try to reach out to, general human rights groups, general development groups, general groups that work on, non-specialized IG issues, that don't work on specialized IG issues and say, hey, let's really get engaged. So that's a problem. Now, ICANN, of course, tries to deal with that. It has expanded significantly in the past few years its staff support for stakeholder engagement and has launched programs and put vice presidents in place, like Jean-Jacques, who had to leave, to try to mobilize more people. But of course, it's an enormous challenge. And lots of people who are concerned with the kinds of issues that Henriette flagged, whether it's privacy, freedom of expression, copyright, net neutrality, mass surveillance, all those types of issues that may deeply concern a lot of internet people. A lot of those folks look at ICANN and go, oh, it's so specialized, it's so arcane. I don't know how to get engaged. I don't know if I want to devote the time. And so they kind of check out. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge to say, look, these are complex processes, but they have set really significant impact on the way the internet works, and you really can engage effectively without committing your entire life to it. It is possible to do that. So much more to be done, but I think we try with what we have.
Henriette.
Just a quick addition. I think, Chris, that there's been quite a lot of outreach, and I think there has been quite a lot of reach, but there are also exclusions. I think gender, for example, you still find in many, particularly in Europe, actually, I find in internet governance communities, relatively few women that are involved. So there are exclusions, there are urban-rural exclusions, and I think in the global internet community there are north-south imbalances as well. There's still sort of most of the active participants in internet governance spaces do come from countries with high internet penetration and involvement in policy. But I think the real disconnect, and I think what makes it quite difficult to be involved, is a very awkward relationship between what happens at a national level and what happens at a global level. And so if you are trying to influence policy or be part of policy processes that impact on how you have internet access, how much you pay for it, and whether you have freedom of expression on the internet or not, once you've got it, you actually have to work both at the global level and at the national level. You have to work at the multi-stakeholder ICANN level, and you have to work at the intergovernmental UN level. And that is enormously challenging. And I think for me that's a real weakness or a bottleneck, that there isn't a very effective, other than the IGF, which I think is the one space that brings these different spheres together, but there aren't really effective linkages between the traditional national level and intergovernmental level decision-making and the multi-stakeholder mechanisms.
Thank you. Christopher, just before we go to your question, Christina, we have been hearing from governments that it's also very challenging. This is a very taxing issue, it's very complex, and on top of everything else that is happening in internet governance and outside, governments have found it challenging. How does the Commission provide this information to its member states and through its also participation at ICANN?
Well, of course, the European Commission has been following closely all these ongoing processes. Together with member states, I have to say that there is a constant dialogue with member states. But also, for instance, with the European Parliament, all institutions have repeatedly said that the multi-stakeholder model is the right model, but at the same time that some improvements are needed. And just also as an example of how closely we are following all these discussions, just this week the Council has produced Council conclusions on the IANA transition. These will be, I think they are already public, or they will be public in the next days. But at the same time also guidelines on the WSIS Plus 10 review, the World Summit on Information Society. Because indeed there are some implications between these different processes. Although we might consider that the ICANN and IANA transition are very limited, very specific to a specific layer, there are global geopolitical implications because indeed it is about the multi-stakeholder model and improvements to this model. The internet has changed. It was born in the US. It was at the beginning it was something really limited. Now it is a global resource. There are countries that are coming on board, that they see the advantages of this model, but there are still some that are not so convinced, and so we need to address also those concerns. We see that this year is going to be very, very important. Timing is essential. We recognize that really a lot of effort has been put into the IANA transition process. The ICANN accountability is also very, very important. Also, the European Commission, some of you might be aware, in the past has repeatedly told ICANN that some improvements were required and needed. I'm thinking, for instance, at the issue about .wine or the .eu in Greek. So there are a number of issues where we had seen some problems, but of course we are trying to overcome this and try to make the model even better and stronger. So considering also the timing this year and the WSIS negotiations coming in December, we really think that some concrete progress needs to be done. It's very good that 2 communities have already their proposals in place. What about the third community, the naming community? We really hope that in the coming weeks and months, real progress will be done. We have to make sure that the right checks and balances are in place. But also, it's important to give clear signs that the status quo is not going to be maintained and that improvements are going to be introduced. So these are my remarks.
Thank you. Christopher, please.
Thank you. Christopher Wilkinson. Of course, Yanis, the transition was announced in the 1997 white paper, and it was part of the global understanding that gave rise to the creation of ICANN in the first place. I would also like to congratulate CRISP and IANA for, and IETF, beg your pardon, CRISP and IETF for getting their act together quickly and successfully. That's what I expected, because you do have structures and traditions that are stronger and longer than the naming community. As Olivier suggested, the naming communities group has taken its time. It's because of the difficulties within the group between the different interested parties. And Bill, I don't think you should look at this through rose-tinted glasses. There is still a lot of work to do. Let me just signal 2 or 3 problems. The first is that the balance of power within the final proposal between the CCTLDs as registries, the GTLDs as registries, and civil society as represented by the at-large group, that balance of power is far from being consensus. And indeed, within the GTLD community, there is a very strong movement on the part of a branch of the legal profession which doesn't actually run a registry, that is occupying a great deal of the time and space. So I really think that needs close attention. A second concern is accountability. And it is the idea that the bottom line of accountability is actually to take IANA away from ICANN, what is called separability. I think we have just about managed to create a final proposal that will circumscribe that option considerably. Because in my opinion, which I've expressed in detail in my public comment on the proposal, in my opinion, if things by any chance would get so bad, and RIPE and IETF has said that they're far from getting bad, they're actually quite good. If things should ever get so bad, the multi-stakeholder community would be almost incapable in terms of the time it would take to find an alternative. So that I really think separability is not a really viable form of accountability. You have to find accountability in the ICANN context through the CCWG in a variety of ways, but to isolate IANA, particularly if some parts of IANA want to separate and other parts don't, I think there's a problem. So there's a big piece of work to be done within the ICG when these proposals are finalized. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christopher. Would you like to react to what Christopher has said? Bill, please.
Yes, I would. Thank you, Christopher, your comment. Just a preface, one of the dangers that always happens in this environment is when ICANN people get together in front of a broader kind of community, we start to do a lot of internal ICANN stuff, which for folks who are outside the process might not be the most penetrable way of conducting the conversation. So I'm not going to drive deep down into the details of this, but I will say this, Chris. Nobody who is, first of all, my glasses are quite clear. They're not rose tinted. There's nobody that I know who believes that multi-stakeholder cooperation automatically evaporates power differences between different players, nor does anybody, I think, naively believe that when it comes down to the final push and you're trying to design a solution, the different parties won't seek advantage and seek to get a configuration that gives them relatively more influence than what they would have otherwise. That's politics. That's inherently, that's part of the process. And what's important about it is that in a multi-stakeholder setting, as opposed to some other settings, nobody's in a position to just force it through over the objections of everybody else and leave everybody just laying on the floor bleeding. Consensus has to be found at some level, and if there isn't, then you go back again, and you go back again, and you go back again. There's a common commitment to working it out at a community level that I think bounds and rules, to some extent, the disparities in power. Institutionalizing the differences through this kind of process is, I think, very effective in keeping the process from breaking down and from having power be the sole driver of everything. The other point, I'm sorry you're not listening to me, Chris, but I will say that I totally disagree about separability. I think separability is a key concern. It is something that we in civil society, in NCUC and our partners, have insisted on from the beginning. It is an idea that has been taken up by a lot of other parties as well. I think it's crucial. Anybody who looks at the way contested markets work in economics knows that if you don't have the possibility of a challenge to authority, market position, whatever, the potential for abusive behavior is increased. Having at least the legal mechanism for separability, having that as a final nuclear option available to the community is actually really quite important. And if, God forbid, we should ever get to the point where it has to be pursued, having that on the table is important.
Thank you, Bill. 2 words, literally.
Just a couple of words, yeah. The IANA department in ICANN is actually only 9 people. That's one thing you should be aware of. They perform the work for the name community, for the protocols community, and for the IP addresses. These 9 people are the ones that would be in the proposal moving to a slightly independent entity. But the thing is that the aim for the whole process is to keep an IANA that continues to work. It's a technical thing. It's a technical function. There's nothing political about it and so on, even though sometimes you hear so much about it. But it's actually technical. So when one is talking about separability and so on, it's not political separability. It's if the IANA function doesn't work, if the people employed in IANA don't do their job and things don't work, we need to have a way to change that. That's why there is the request.
Thank you. Michele.
Thanks, Michele Nalem. Speaking on behalf of myself as always, because nobody else would pay me, I suppose. There's a couple of comments and then actually a question. To the lady over there, I'm not sure of your name, sorry. I have to strongly disagree with your pretty much everything you've said on this podium today. Pretty much everything you've said, I've listened to it, I've sat there, and I've come out with a few 3-letter acronyms because I just was so taken aback. I mean, you're conflating a whole range of different issues together and then saying, based on that conflation, which I can consider wholly erroneous, that the multi-stakeholder model doesn't work. The internet as we have it today, warts and all, works at a technical level due to the multi-stakeholder process. I mean, you're looking at IP addresses, which are at the bottom. They're the thing that a network of networks needs. Is everything has to have an IP address. It works. Sometimes it might not work the way you want it to work, but it does work. Conflating that with issues of national governments and private companies censoring content, they're 2 totally different things. And if you want to address issues around censorship, that's fine, but please don't say that because there is some censorship somewhere that everything else doesn't work, because I don't see the 2 as being linked at all. With respect to the severability thing, again, I agree with what Bill is saying. It is important. But the question I have, I suppose, is one around timing. I mean, this entire process has been going on now for, it's over a year, isn't it?
18 months.
It's 18 months. The IANA contract itself expires end of September, I believe. They can extend it slightly, but there's a bit of it, there's the elephant in the room. Obama's term is almost up. The Congress and everything else is becoming more and more dominated by rather extreme conservative elements who seem to think that Obama is selling the internet, which is kind of interesting, because he definitely didn't own my part of it. But how is this going to work in terms of timing? Because I mean, we've been talking about this in multiple locations, and I know that a lot of you have put in ridiculous numbers of hours into coming up with all these proposals. But at what point will it be ready to actually pull the trigger, and will that timing arrive in time for not to get mixed up with the US elections, which I think could have an interesting impact? Thanks.
Elliot?
I want to make two comments. The first, I don't actually think you guys are disagreeing as much as you think you're disagreeing. I think your point was, in fact, that these things are severable, but that there are other issues that just because this works doesn't mean that everything in internet governance works. Second point is to your question and timing. Secretary Strickling actually sent a note, I guess, to the ICG and through ICANN, as I understand it, and it arrived on the doorstep of each of the communities, and asking about how much time we would need. And I believe a response is forthcoming, at least from the IETF community, if I understand things correctly. And it was discussed on the IANA plan list, which is open to all parties, by the way, and if you want to join, you just get on the list. What we essentially said is, we're ready now, right? You want to pull the trigger? The IETF's ready now. Now, there are a couple of aspects which could slow us down. There are interrelationships between the proposals, and we don't know the answer to what all those interrelationships will be until the names community in particular completes their proposal. Thank you.
Thank you. So,
can I respond just quickly to that?
Quickly.
I think that's precisely what I said. Because it's working for names and numbers, don't, based on that, make the assumption that it's working everywhere. And I think, and for all aspects of internet governance. So actually, I think you were right. We're not disagreeing. But I think the interesting thing about this and about if our goal is to have functional, sustainable, multi-stakeholder approaches to internet policy at all levels, not just naming and numbers, then we do need to think about how we're going to get there. And I think the IANA transition is an interesting example of, and the ICANN accountability question. And I think what we are not doing effectively often is having indicators. What is accountability? How can we apply it? What is democratic multi-stakeholder governance? What is participation? And have principles that can actually then be used at a broader, more general level to help us assess whether we are actually succeeding in transforming decision-making processes more widely.
Thank you. So I would like to go back to one tweet, which unfortunately is not here. Oh, no, it's here. So it says, my understanding so far, we have nice, agreeable ideas on how to run the internet, but we're inherently doomed because of politics. So taking on from that tweet, and I think one of the things that we all agree is that the IANA transition process is highly technical. However, inevitably there are some politics. So Yanis, turning into you, what are the messages you think that we need to take on as we move into WSIS? And what are the messages that this group of people that have tirelessly worked and have exchanged so many emails and have stayed up long hours, what are the messages that we need to communicate to governments that do not necessarily know about this process and about all these hours that have been spent on this process discussing the IANA stewardship transition?
Actually, I was listening to this discussion and I caught myself to a thought that we're not talking about IANA function at all. IANA function works, as I heard here, and then the communities are happy. Actually, I have not heard many complaints from named community that IANA function wouldn't work. All that we're talking about is the oversight over IANA function, and I think that this is something that didn't come across in this conversation. Coming back to what I said at the beginning, 2005, the oversight of United States over ICANN was the key political issue. And of course, ICANN at that time had different level of maturity as organization, and therefore there was a very tight linkage with the NTIA. We had ICANN had a memorandum of understanding with a 6-month reporting obligation, with a 6-month performance benchmark establishment, and then these type of things. So then, something around 2007-8 came a memorandum of understanding, was replaced, and then in 2010 it was again replaced by very loose affirmation of commitments. So on that side, and a commitment of United States government to work through the GAC, to exercise influence. From that perspective, every aspect that we discussed in 2005 over the role of United States government in internet governance and overseeing ICANN was taken away, in a sense. So IANA, oversight over IANA was the only remaining issue that has not changed since 2005. And when I'm talking about WSIS, I'm always referring to the framework that we discussed, because we need a reference point. And then of course, now we see that the accountability question become very important, because until now, the US government was seen as a guarantor that IANA function as such will be performed in the best possible way. And hence we have this conversation, which is very political, because accountability is, in a sense, something that people measure in a very subjective way. It cannot be measured in zeros and ones. Some actions can be, but not everything. It's all about perception. And as far as I see, we're talking about this 0.1 or even 0.01% of probability that things will go really sour. And that takes so much time. Because if we would be rational as individuals, we would agree that let's talk about what is possible, not what is hypothetically possible, and do it, and that would be very quick and simple. Now we're trying to project what may happen if something would go sour, and that takes much more time. So it is political, and I agree, and we're looking for the balance that every community would feel reasonably comfortable or reasonably uncomfortable, but equally reasonably uncomfortable. So that takes time. But what is very positive that the community is engaged, and there no anyone who stands out as it used to be actually with the Government Advisory Committee when policies in ICANN were developed without participation of the GAC, and then GAC came in at the last moment and said, hey, by the way, the public policy is not taken into account. Today, GAC is much more involved in policy development throughout the period, throughout the policy development process, and that also ensures that everybody has its own sort of pie in the steak from very beginning.
Thank you. Any questions from the participants? So I will ask one question. Christina, going back to you. So the Commission, as you said, is a big supporter of the multi-stakeholder model, which of course is the model that we currently see in the IANA process. How, moving into WSIS, and I'm going because there is this bigger picture that is happening on the side of the IANA stewardship transition, how would the Commission facilitate the multi-stakeholder model, especially in terms of convincing other governments that are not so much in favor of the model because they don't know it or because they don't agree with it? So how would the Commission, stepping into the WSIS 10 process, make sure that the model is supported?
Of course, it's not an easy task. I think also linking up to what Yanis was saying, we have to acknowledge the complexity of the issues, but we also should clearly signal that we are going towards the right direction. So this is very important to signal this and to continue efforts in that direction. At the same time, we have to do more homework on different fronts. I think that, for instance, this year IGF will be very important to show again that another important actor in the internet ecosystem is able to evolve, is able to show that it is, delivering on the expectations that the global community has. And at the same time, another layer is, okay, the WSIS negotiation. So now that we have member states in Europe that have agreed on concrete guidelines, this will help us a lot. This will facilitate our work. It will help Europe, the EU, to have a united voice during those negotiations. And there, the main challenge will be to bring the discussions back on developmental issues, to ICT for development, ICT for sustainable goals, and not too much into discussions about internet governance, because there are other structures, other layers where these issues are better addressed. And so these are our arguments to also explain this to those countries that do not share this view. Another issue as well is the how to make the multi-stakeholder model more inclusive, more democratic. And here we also are trying to bring our little piece of contribution, which is the creation of a global policy observatory on internet governance as a way to facilitate the spread and share of information for those who are not able, for instance, to follow all the thousands of emails on the ICANN and IANA transition, or to devote hours, hundreds of hours, I think, on these processes. So this is yet a little effort that we are trying to offer to the global community as a way to further explain the benefits and the advantages of the multi-stakeholder model, and to also try to fill in some of the gaps.
Thank you. Nurani, how can communities like the Numbers community facilitate friendly governments and actually enhance the multi-stakeholder model?
Ooh, that was a curveball. I was going to make a few other points, but I'll try to address that. How can the Numbers community help governments support the multi-stakeholder model? Well, I always find it a little bit difficult when you talk about internet governance and multi-stakeholderism. It gets talked about as if it's this this thing of its own, and So first of all, I think you can't talk about. So here today we've talked about a few different things. We've talked about the IANA transition, its impact on and what it means. And no, it won't impact your lolcat blog. Thank God for that. Regardless of what will happen in this transition, that will continue to work. We've talked about trust and accountability, and actually, I'm going to make myself look smart by quoting my co-panelist, something she said at the latest RIGHT meeting. And she said, accountability is important to achieve trust. But unless you have trust, it doesn't matter how many accountability mechanisms you have. You'll never have accountability. And so when we talk about this multi-stakeholder model and internet governance, I think you fool yourself if you think that you can apply this multi-stakeholder model to all things internet governance. There's certainly principles that you can apply, such as inclusiveness and transparency and participatory processes and equal representation. But not everyone on this planet has a stake in every issue that gets defined as internet governance by someone. So I really think it's about finding what stakeholders have a stake in what issue, and you need to find models for that. So how can the RIR communities help governments support the multi-stakeholder model? Well, I think what the numbers community can do is to provide expertise, not just technical expertise, but also to show what works and what doesn't work for them in the structures that have matured over the years. Doesn't mean that you can take the IETF model or the RAR model and say, okay, we're going to apply that to every internet governance issue out there. I think if you think that, you're fooling yourself. So by working together with not just governments, but with civil society, with business, with all the different stakeholders, and sharing that experience, I think that's the only way you can find that right multi-stakeholder model for that particular internet governance issue.
Thank you. Henriette, please.
Just, I know we don't have much time left, but just to come back a little bit to the issue of the transition and the WSIS, I think what's really interesting and what will be important as well in terms of its broader implications is how the global audience will respond to this. I think with the IANA transition, there's the community itself, those that have been very engaged and that are submitting comments. So that's a very important audience. I think US politics and US legislators, that's another very important audience. But then the global community is also an important audience. And how, what state the transition is at and how it's represented and described and viewed in December during the WSIS review is in fact going to be very important, and I think can either be a bottleneck to having the broader development-oriented discussions that Christina is talking about, plus the broader democratizing, how do we institutionalize multi-stakeholder inclusive approaches to internet policy at national level, or an enabler. And I think that is what I'd actually like to get a response from fellow panelists and people in the audience, how at this point in time they anticipate that global audience, considering all the changes, as Giannis have pointed out, since 2005. How can we anticipate they would respond?
Bill.
Well, thank you. There are indeed many audiences, but certainly one of the most pressing ones are those representatives of governments that come to the UN General Assembly. And those representatives, particularly from the G77 in China, who come to New York meetings of the General Assembly, are probably likely not to be deeply versed in the ins and outs of internet governance, and are potentially likely to view things in kind of straight geopolitical terms. How do you do tactical bargaining, tit for tat, get resources, make demands, buy off demands with other counter proposals, etc. This is difficult. What you need is a real debate that is two-level, both at the national, as you said before, and at the global, and I suspect that what will happen is that a lot of the government delegates that will come into the room will not have engaged in that domestic level or multi-stakeholder kind of discussion at all, and will be making decisions based on the usual ways in which that bargaining is done in that space. So then things could go bad, and you could have governments trying to play any pause or extension in the process as, see, this proves that the multi-stakeholder thing doesn't work and something else needs to be put in place, everything's inadequate, blah, blah, blah. There could be a lot of that stuff again. And Christina, the one thing I wonder about is, you know, during, and I'll stop in a second, during the WSIS a decade ago, there were a lot of efforts to try to say, when governments were pressing oversight of critical internet resources, to say, you know, we're focusing on the wrong issues. The WSIS should be looking at the global information society generally. We should be talking about ICT for development. We should be talking about what really will work to change the quality of life on the ground in countries for people-centered development. And who signs the root is really probably not the most pressing issue. And they weren't having it. The governments that were there were not having it. They were going to focus on this issue because it had symbolic significance. It was easy to address. There was a lot of larger contextual factors, the Bush era. So I hope that we can get the direction of the discussion pointed correctly, but I'm not sure that that's going to happen. I think there's a lot of risks ahead, actually.
Thanks. Quick reaction, Christine, and then
Just a
Olivier.
quick reaction. I totally agree with you on the risks. So it will be, you know, quite difficult and important to be united, at least as European, at the same time to reach out to some of the middle ground countries, because the G77 bloc is not a bloc after all, so there are some countries which could move. And then also we have this time the possibility to show what has been done in the last 10 years. So many of these countries are not developing countries anymore. For instance, in Latin America, there has been a lot of progress and advancement, and so we need to focus on developing a positive narrative, convincing them that thanks to this model, these positive developments have taken place. I agree, it's not going to be easy, but at least we have a starting base, we have the experience of 10 years. We also have to be ready to show where we need to focus next and, for instance, try to avoid the creation of new digital gaps, like we were talking today about broadband development in another session. There is the risk that some of the developing countries will be in a new digital gap because they don't have access to high-speed broadband. And we need to be ready also to help them overcome these gaps.
Thank you. Olivier?
My usual 2 minutes or 2 seconds. The naming proposal went for consultation, and there have been a few governments that have responded to it. Some have been critical of the actual proposal. Some have been critical of the process, saying it wasn't inclusive enough, etc. Some have been actually supportive of the process and supportive of the proposal. I really hope that governments, when they meet later on, will actually judge the track record of WISIS and the track record of all that's been done so far based on the actual record of what we've done so far, and not based on geopolitical reasons. There's always a danger that this could happen.
Thank you. And I think we should close. And I think this is a great message as we are thinking of these processes. The IANA transition process has demonstrated an amazing amount of transparency in terms of the information sharing and the inclusive of the community. I would encourage you, as all panelists here, to, if you're interested, to get included in the processes through the ITF, through the RARs, and the names community through ICANN. And of course, we have the IGF and the WISIS plus 10, so watch the space. Thank you very much. Thank you all for participating. Thank you all for your questions. Have a good afternoon.